The Sermon on the Mount, Key Teachings, Part 2. Welcome to the continuation of our exploration of the Sermon on the Mount. In this video, we'll delve into the second part of Jesus' teachings, which focuses on our relationship with God and our attitude towards material possessions. These teachings, just as revolutionary as those we've seen before, go to the heart of what it means to live an authentic life of faith. Before diving into the content, let's remind ourselves of the context. Jesus is addressing a diverse crowd in Galilee, a region where Jews and Gentiles coexisted. His listeners are living under Roman occupation in a society marked by great economic inequalities. For many, religious practice had become a matter of appearances rather than sincere devotion. It's in this context that Jesus will address topics such as almsgiving, prayer, fasting, and attitudes towards wealth. His teachings will challenge established religious practices and call for an authentic and transformative spirituality. Jesus begins this section by addressing the practice of almsgiving. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. Matthew 6:1. In the Jewish culture of the time, almsgiving, giving to the poor, was considered an act of righteousness, not just charity. It was an important religious duty. However, some had transformed this act of compassion into a public display of piety. Jesus harshly criticizes this practice. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Matthew 6:2. The image of announcing with trumpets is probably hyperbolic, but it strikingly illustrates the seeking of attention and public recognition that Jesus condemns. Instead, he recommends, "But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret." Matthew 6:3-4. This principle of discretion in generosity goes against our modern culture, where philanthropic donations are often accompanied by much publicity. Jesus calls us to generosity motivated by love and compassion, not by the search for recognition. Practical application. Reflect on your giving habits. Are you motivated by a sincere desire to help, or by the recognition you might receive? How could you practice more discreet generosity? Perhaps you could make an anonymous donation to a cause close to your heart, or help someone in need without telling anyone about it. Jesus then moves on to the question of prayer, another pillar of Jewish religious life. As with almsgiving, he criticizes those who pray to be seen. "And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others." Matthew 6:5. Instead, Jesus recommends a practice of private and sincere prayer. "But when you pray, go into your room, close the door and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." Matthew 6:6. This emphasis on private prayer doesn't mean that public or communal prayer is wrong. Jesus himself prayed publicly on several occasions. What he condemns is prayer used as a display of piety. Jesus also warns against babbling in prayer. "And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words." This doesn't mean that long prayers are wrong. Jesus himself sometimes prayed all night, but rather that prayer should not be a mechanical recitation or an attempt to manipulate God with our words. It's in this context that Jesus teaches the Lord's Prayer, a simple yet profound model of prayer that covers all the essential aspects of our relationship with God and with others. Practical application. Examine your prayer life. Is it authentic and personal, or has it become an empty routine? How could you cultivate a more sincere and intimate practice of prayer? Perhaps you could dedicate time each day to pray using the model of the Lord's Prayer, deeply reflecting on each phrase. Jesus then addresses the practice of fasting, another important spiritual discipline in the Jewish tradition. As with almsgiving and prayer, he warns against ostentation. "When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting." Matthew 6:16. In Jesus' time, some ostentatiously displayed their fasting, covering themselves with ashes and adopting a miserable appearance to draw attention to their piety. Jesus categorically rejects this approach. Instead, he recommends, "But when you fast, Put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father, who is unseen. Matthew 6, verse 17-18. This instruction from Jesus is not meant to encourage deception, but rather to emphasize that fasting is a personal spiritual discipline between the individual and God. It should not be practiced to impress others or gain their approval. Fasting, in the biblical tradition, is not simply a deprivation of food. It's a time dedicated to prayer, reflection, and spiritual refocusing. It's a way to remind ourselves of our dependence on God and to focus on spiritual rather than material things. Practical application. Have you ever practiced fasting as a spiritual discipline? If so, what were your motivation? If not, how could you incorporate this practice into your spiritual life in a way that aligns with Jesus' teachings? Perhaps you could try a one-day fast, dedicating the time normally spent eating to prayer and meditation on God's Word. Jesus then moves on to a topic that touches each of us, our attitude towards material possession. He begins with a striking statement. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. Matthew 6, verse 19-20. This instruction from Jesus is not an absolute condemnation of owning material goods. Rather, it's a call to reconsider our priorities and reflect on what has lasting value. Jesus continues with a profound observation. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Matthew 6:21. In other words, what we value most shapes our character and our life. If our treasure is in material possessions, our heart will be constantly preoccupied with acquiring and protecting these goods. But if our treasure is in the things of God, love, justice, compassion, our heart will be oriented towards these eternal values. This perspective on wealth was radical in Jesus' time, and it remains so today. In a culture that often measures a person's worth by their material possessions, Jesus' call to seek heavenly treasures is a powerful challenge. Practical application. Take a moment to reflect on what you consider your treasure. Where do you invest the majority of your time, energy, and resources? How could you reorient your priorities to invest more in heavenly treasures? Perhaps you could dedicate more time to serving others, or use your resources to support causes that reflect the values of God's kingdom. Jesus then uses an intriguing metaphor. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. Matthew 6, verse 22-23. In the context of his teaching on wealth, this metaphor seems to refer to our perspective on life and values. A healthy eye represents a clear vision of spiritual priorities, while an unhealthy eye suggests a perspective obscured by greed or materialism. This image reminds us that our way of seeing the world, our values, our priorities, our understanding of what is truly important, profoundly influences our entire life. If our vision is clear and aligned with the values of God's kingdom, our whole life will be full of light. But if our vision is obscured by worldly values, our entire life will be negatively affected. Practical application. Examine your vision of life. What values and priorities guide your decisions? How could you cultivate a perspective more aligned with the values of God's kingdom? Perhaps you could spend time meditating on Jesus' teachings, asking God to help you see the world through his eyes. Jesus concludes this section with a powerful statement. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Matthew 6, verse 24. Mammon is an Aramaic term that means wealth or possessions. By personifying mammon as an alternative master to God, Jesus emphasizes the power that money and material possessions can have over our lives. This statement by Jesus is not a condemnation of wealth itself, but a warning against the danger of making money our God. When acquiring and preserving wealth becomes our main priority, it takes God's place in our lives. Jesus' teaching challenges us to examine where our true allegiance lies. Are we serving God, using our resources for his kingdom? Or are we serving mammon, making the acquisition of wealth the main purpose of our life? Practical application. Reflect on your relationship with money and material possessions. Do they serve your spiritual goals, or do you find yourself enslaved to them? How could you use your resources in a way that honors God and serves His kingdom? Perhaps you could establish a budget that reflects your spiritual priorities, making sure to set aside a portion of your resources for causes that reflect the values of God's kingdom. Jesus continues His teaching by addressing a universal topic, worry, particularly concerning our material needs. Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Matthew 6, verse 25. This instruction might seem unrealistic at first glance. After all, isn't it natural and even necessary to be concerned about our basic needs? But Jesus is not calling for irresponsibility or laziness. Rather, He's inviting us to a deep trust in God's providence. Jesus illustrates His point by referring to nature. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Matthew 6:26. He also uses the example of the lilies of the field, highlighting their beauty despite their ephemeral existence. These examples are not an invitation to passivity or irresponsibility. Birds, after all, work hard to find their food. Rather, Jesus is inviting us to a deep trust in God's goodness and providence. Trust that frees us from paralyzing anxiety. Jesus goes on to highlight the futility of worry. Can any one of you by worrying add a single hour to your life? Matthew 6:27. Worry not only solves nothing, but it can actually diminish our quality of life and our ability to act constructively. The solution Jesus proposes is radical. But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Matthew 6:33. He doesn't promise a life without difficulties, but He affirms that if we align our priorities with God's, our needs will be met. Practical application. Identify areas of your life that are sources of chronic worry. How could you apply Jesus' teaching to these situations? Perhaps you could start each day by seeking first God's kingdom, maybe through prayer or Bible reading, before diving into your daily concerns. Whenever you feel anxious, try to redirect your attention to God's faithfulness and His promises. Jesus then moves on to another crucial aspect of human relationships: judgment. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. Matthew 7:1. This statement is often quoted but often misunderstood. Jesus is not prohibiting all moral discernment or evaluation of others' actions. After all, later in this same sermon, He warns us against false prophets, which implies some judgment. What He condemns is the hypocritical attitude of judging others harshly while being blind to our own faults. He illustrates this point with a striking image. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? Matthew 7, verse 3. This humorous image highlights the absurdity of our tendency to maximize others' faults while minimizing our own. The solution Jesus proposes is not to abstain from all judgment, but to begin with an honest self-examination. You hypocrite! First, take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Matthew 7, verse 5. This teaching calls us to deep humility and a keen awareness of our own imperfection. It invites us to approach others with compassion and understanding, recognizing that we are all on a journey, all imperfect, all in need of God's grace. Practical application. The next time you catch yourself judging someone harshly, pause. Ask yourself, what plank in my own life might I be neglecting? How can you cultivate an attitude of grace and compassion towards others while maintaining healthy discernment? Perhaps you could make a habit of praying for those you're tempted to judge, asking God to show you how to see them through His eyes. Jesus then returns to the theme of prayer, this time emphasizing the importance of perseverance. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened to you. Matthew 7, verse 7. This triple exhortation underlines the importance of persistence in our prayer life. Jesus doesn't envision prayer as a magic formula that produces instant results, but as an ongoing relationship with God that involves active seeking and patient waiting. To illustrate God's goodness in answering our prayers, Jesus uses a familiar analogy. Which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? or if he asks for a fish, we'll give him a snake. Matthew 7, verse 9 to 10. If even imperfect parents know how to give good things to their children, how much more will our perfect Heavenly Father respond to our prayers with kindness and wisdom? However, this doesn't mean that God will always give us exactly what we ask for. Like a wise parent, God gives what is truly good for us, what aligns with His will and His purposes for our life. Practical application. Reflect on your prayer life. Are you persistent in your requests to God? How could you cultivate an attitude of perseverance in prayer? Perhaps you could keep a prayer journal, noting your requests and God's answers over time. This can help you see God's faithfulness, even when answers don't come as we expect. Jesus concludes this section of his teaching with what is often called the Golden Rule. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets. Matthew 7:12. This statement powerfully summarizes the essence of Jesus' ethic. It goes beyond the negative formulation found in other traditions. Don't do to others what you wouldn't want done to you, calling for positive and proactive action. This rule requires us to put ourselves in the other person's place, to imagine their needs and desires, and to act accordingly. It's a call to active empathy and concrete compassion. By saying that this rule sums up the law and the prophets, Jesus indicates that it encapsulates the essence of all the ethical teaching of the Old Testament. It's a radical simplification that makes ethics accessible to all, while being deeply demanding in its application. Practical application. Choose a relationship or situation in your life where you find it difficult to apply the Golden Rule. Take time to really put yourself in the other person's shoes. What would you want if you were in their situation? What concrete action can you take to treat this person as you would want to be treated? In conclusion to this second part of the key teachings of the Sermon on the Mount, we see Jesus addressing fundamental aspects of our spiritual life and our relationships with others. From the practice of generosity and prayer to our attitude towards material goods, from our tendency to judge to our call to treat others with love, these teachings challenge us to a profound transformation in our way of living. These teachings of Jesus are not simple rules to follow, but an invitation to a new way of being. They call us to radical authenticity in our spiritual life, with deep trust in God's goodness, and to active compassion towards others. Of course, living according to these principles is not easy. They often go against our natural instincts and the dominant values of our society. But Jesus assures us that this is the path to a truly fulfilling life, a life aligned with the values of God's kingdom. As we conclude this video, I invite you to reflect. Which aspect of Jesus' teaching challenges you the most personally? Why? How could these teachings transform your spiritual life and your relationships with others? You took them really seriously. Where do you need God's grace and power to live according to these principles? Choose one concrete action you can take this week. Put one of these teachings into practice. Remember, the goal is not immediate perfection, but a process of continuous growth. Every little step counts. Each time we choose discreet generosity over ostentation, sincere prayer over empty routine, trust in God over anxiety, humility over judgment, we take one more step on the path of the kingdom. In our next video, we'll explore the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus challenges us to put his words into practice. We'll see how he contrasts the narrow path that leads to life, the broad path that leads to destruction, and how he calls us to build our life on the solid rock of his teachings. Until then, may the grace and peace of him who gave us these transformative teachings be with you. May you be salt and light in the world, living in a way that reflects God's character and love. May your life be a living testimony to the transforming power of the gospel, bringing hope, love, and reconciliation to a world that desperately needs it.